Okay, reading 19 of the CFA Level 1 program curriculum on economics, now on international trade and capital flow. Learning outcomes, the candidate should be able to compare gross domestic product and gross national product, describe benefits and costs of international trade, distinguish between comparative advantage and absolute advantage, compares the Ricardian and Raster Odian models of trade and sources of comparative advantage in each model. Compare types of trade and capital restrictions of the economic implications. Explain motivations for advantages of trading blocks, common markets, and economic unions. Describe common objectives of capital restrictions imposed by governments. Describe the balance of payments accounts, including the components, and explain how decisions by customers, firms, and governments affect business balance of payments. Describe functions and objectives of the international organization to facilitate trade, including the World Bank and World International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization. Introduction: global investors must address two fundamental interrelated questions: where to invest and what asset classes. Some countries may be attractive for an equity perspective because they're strong economic growth and the profitability for particular domestic sectors of industry. Other countries may be attractive from a fixed income perspective because of their interest rate environment and price stability. To identify markets that are expected to provide attractive investment opportunities, investors must analyze cross-country differences in such factors such as GDP growth rates, monetary and fiscal policies, trade policies, and competitiveness. From a longer-term perspective, investors need to consider such factors such as a country's stage on economic and financial market development, demographic, quality and quantity of physical and human capital, accumulated education and training of workers, and its areas of comparative advantage. This reading provides a framework for analyzing a country's trade and capital flows and their economic implications. International trade can facilitate economic growth by increasing the efficiency of resource allocation, providing access to larger capital and product markets, and facilitate specialization based on comparative advantages. The flow of capital, of financial capital, funds available for investment between countries with access to savings, and those where financial capital is scarce can increase liquidity, raise output, and lower the cost of capital. From an investment perspective, it is important to understand the complex and dynamic natures of international trade and capital flows because investment opportunities are increasingly exposed to forces of global competition, markets, capitals, and ideas. This reading is organized as follows. Section 2 defines basic terminology used in the reading and describes pattern and trends in international trade and capital flows. It also discusses the benefits of international trade, distinguishes between absolute and comparative advantage, and explains two traditional models of comparative advantage. Section 3 describes the trade restrictions and their implications and discusses the motivation for advantages of trade agreements. Section 4 describes the balance of payments, and Section 5 discusses the function of objectives of international organizations to facilitate trade. A summary and key points and practice problems concludes the reading. International trade. The following section describes the role, importance, and possible benefit and cost of international trade. Before beginning the discussion, we define some basic terminology used in this area. The aggregate output of a nation over a specific time period is usually measured as a gross domestic product or its gross national product. Gross domestic product, GDP, measures the market value of all final goods and services produced by factors of production such as labor and capital located within a country/economy during a given period of time, generally a year or a quarter. Gross national product, GNP, however, measures the market value of all final goods and services produced by factors of production supplied by residents of a country, regardless of whether the production takes place within the country or outside of the country. The difference between a country's GDP and GNP is that GDP includes and GNP excludes the production of goods and services by foreigners within the country, whereas GDP includes and GDP excludes the production of goods and services by a citizen outside of the country. Countries have large differences between GDP and GNP, generally have a large number of citizens who work abroad, for example, Pakistan and Portugal, and or pay more for the use of foreign-owned capital in domestic production from abroad, such as Brazil, and Canada. Therefore, GDP is more widely used as a measure of economic activity occurring within a country, which in turn affects employment growth and investment environments. Imports are goods and services that a domestic economy, i.e. household, firms, and government purchases from other countries. For example, the U.S. economy imports or purchases cloth from India and wine from France. Exports are goods and services that domestic economy sells to other countries. For example, South Africa exports or sells diamonds to the Netherlands, and China exports clothing to the European Union. So how are services imported and exported? If a Greek shipping company transports the wine, the U.S. Imports from France, the United States will classify the cost of shipping as an import of services from Greece, and the wine, which is classified to be import good, from France. Similarly, when the British company provides insurance coverage to a South African diamond exporter, the British will classify the cost of the insurance of an export service to South Africa. Other examples of service exported/imported includes engineering, consulting, and medical services. The terms of trade are defined as the ratio of the price of exports to the price of imports, representing these price by exports and import price indexes respectively. The term of trade captures the relative cost of imports in terms of exports. If the price of exports increases relative to the price of imports, the terms have improved because the country will be able to purchase more imports with the same amount of exports. For example, when oil prices increased during 2007 to 2008, a major oil exporting country experienced an improvement in their terms of trade because they have export less oil in order to purchase the same amount of imported goods. In contrast, if the price of exports decrease relative to the price of imports, the term of trade has deteriorated because the country will be able to purchase fewer imports with the same amount of exports. Because each country exports and imports a large number of goods and services, the terms of trade of a country are usually measured as an index number normalized to 100 in some base year. That represents a ratio of the average price of exported goods and services to the average price of the imported goods and services. Exhibit 1 shows the term of trade for a Salvatore, a value under, okay. As an example, Exhibit 1 indicates that from 1991 to 2006, both the broader groups developed in industrial countries experienced a slight decline in their terms of trade. Looking at this aggregate data indicates that the developing countries, Asia and the Western Hemisphere, experience a considerably decline in terms of trade, whilst the European and Middle East, which benefits from rising prices of the petroleum exports, experience a substantial increase. Africa has experienced a small improvement in the terms of trade during the period. Now, exports is the difference between the value of a currency's exports and the value of imports, i.e. value of exports minus imports. If the value of exports equals the value of imports, then trade is balanced. If the value of exports is greater or less than the value of imports, then there are a trade surplus or deficit. When a country has a trade surplus, it lends to foreigners to buy assets from foreigners, reflecting the financing needed by foreigners running trade deficits with that country. Similarly, when a country has a trade deficit, it has to borrow from foreigners or sell some of its assets to foreigners. Section 4 on the balance of payments explains these relationships more fully. Autarky is a state which a country does not trade with other countries. It means that all goods and services are produced and consumed domestically. The price of all goods and services in such economy is called the autarkic price. The autarkic economy is known as a closed economy because it does not trade with other companies. An open economy, in contrast, is an economy that trades with other countries. If there are no restrictions on trade, the number of open economies will be able to buy, sell goods will be prevailing in the world market. The world price, the open economy can provide domestic households with a larger variety of goods and services. Given domestic companies access to global markets and customers, and offers goods and services that are more compatibly priced. In addition, it can offer domestic investors access to foreign capital markets, foreign assets, and greater investment opportunities. For capital investment industries such as automobiles and aircrafts, Manufacturers can take advantage of economies of scale because they have to access to a much larger market. Free trade occurs when there are no government restrictions on a country's ability to trade. Under free trade, global aggregate demand and supply determines the equilibrium, quantity and price of imports and exports. Government policies that impose restrictions on trade, such as tariffs and quota, discussed later in the reading, is known as trade protections, and prevent market forces, demand and supply from determining the equilibrium price and quantity for imports and exports. According to Dardroff, globalization refers to increasing worldwide integration of markets for goods and goods, services, and capital that begin to attract special attention in the late 1990s. It also refers to a variety of other changes that were perceived to occur at about the same time, such as an increased role of large corporations, multinational corporations in the world economy, and increased intervention into domestic policies and affairs by international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank. The level of aggregate demand and supply and quantities of imports and exports in the economy are related to the concept of excess demand and excess supply. Exhibit 2 shows supply and demand curves of cars in the United Kingdom. E is the autarkic equilibrium price and quantity, and the quantity of cars demanded equaling the quantity supplied. Now consider a situation in which a country opens up to trade and the world price P1 at the price of quantity demanded domestically, while the quantity supplied is QJ. Hence, excess demand is as such. So here's the illustration. Anyone who studied economics will be very familiar. Patterns and trends in economic trade and capital flows. The importance of trade is absolute and relative terms. Trade to GDP ratio is illustrated in Exhibit 3 through 5. Exhibit 5 shows the trade as a percentage of regional GDP increase in all regions of the world through 1970 to 2006. Developing countries in Asia has the fastest growth in trends, decreasing from the less of 20% of GDP in 1970 to more than 90% of GDP in 2006. So here's the graph illustrating it. Exhibit 4 indicates that the trade as a percentage of GDP and the GDP growth rate has increased as much of the region of the world during 1990 to 2006. However, data for 2008 is not shown, indicating a decline that, although consistent with the worldwide economic downturn, varied across country groups. High-income countries that are members of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OEDCs, experienced a growth rate of 2.4 during 2000 to 2006, but had a growth rate of only 0.3 in 2008. The corresponding numbers of growth in non-OEDC numbers are high-income countries are 5% and 3.2% respectively, and the lower middle income countries are such. So this is just interpreting the data. Of course, trade is not only factor that influences economic growth. Research has also identified such factors as quality of institutions, infrastructure, and education, economic systems, and degrees of development. Exhibit 5 presents the trade and foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP and selective countries of 1980 to 2007. Foreign direct investment refers to direct investment by a firm in one country in productive assets in a foreign country. When a firm engages in a foreign direct investment, it becomes a multinational corporation operating in many more than one country or having subsidiary firms in more than one country. It is important to distinguish FDI, foreign direct investments, from foreign portfolio investments, which refers to short-term investments by individual firms and institutional investors in such foreign financial instruments as foreign stocks and foreign government bonds. Exhibit 5 shows that trade as a percent of GDP for the world as a whole increased from 38 in 1980 to 57 in 2007. In Argentina, trade as a percentage of GDP increased from 12% to 45%, while India during the same period increased from 15 to 45%. Among the more advanced economies, trade expanded sharply in Germany from 45 to 87%, but in the United States, trade expanded modestly from 21 to 29%. The increasing importance of multinational corporations is also apparent in Exhibit 5. Net FDI inflows and outflows increase as a percentage of GDP between 1980 and 2000 for each of the countries shown. Trade between multinational firms and their subsidiaries, i.e. intra-firm trade, has become an important part of the world trade. For example, 46% of U.S. imports occurs between related prices. Globalization of production has increased the productive efficiency of manufacturing firms because they are able to decompose their value chains into individual components or parts and then outsource their production to different locations with correspondents can produce more efficiently. Therefore, Nintendo's Wii remote is manufactured with components sourced from several locations in the world. The accelerator is manufactured in the United States. The memory chip in Italy. The data converter in the United States, Thailand, and India. The plastic casing is assembled in China and designed in Japan. The Bluetooth chip is manufactured in Taiwan and designed in California, and the Rambo pack is manufactured in various locations in Asia. Foreign direct investment and outsourcing has increased business investment in these economies and provided smaller and less developed economies the opportunity to participate in international trade. For example, the World Investment Report indicates that in January 2002, Intel had 13 fabrication plants and 11 assembly testing sites in 7 countries and regions. It was a leading exports in Ireland, Philippines, Costa Rica, and the 17th most foreign exports to China. These trends indicate an increasing global interdependence on economies. Although the degree of interdependence varies, greater interdependence may also means that economies are now more exposed to global competition. As a result of they must be flexible to the production structure in order to respond effectively to changes in global demand and supply. The complexity of trading relationships has also increased with the development of sophisticated global supply chain and includes not only final goods but also intermediate goods and services. Increasing global interdependence has changed the risks and return profile of many economies. Economies have greater international links, are more exposed to and affected by economic downturns and crises occurring in other parts of the world. The contagion effect of the Asian financial crisis, which began in Thailand in 1997, spread to many other markets such as Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. It even affected Brazil and Russia in some degree, although there is less clarity in how the mechanisms by which a crisis spreads beyond Asia. Among the outward symptoms of the crisis were exchange rate problems such as currency speculations and large depreciation of currencies, capital flight, and financial and industrial sector bankruptcies. However, recovery was surprisingly swift and the economies exhibit positive growth by the second quarter of 1999. Benefits and costs of international trade. The preceding section has described the growth of world trade and increasing interdependence of national economies. Has trade been beneficial? The benefits and costs of international trade has been widely debated. The most compelling arguments supporting international trade are countries gain from exchange and specialization, industries experience greater economies of scale, households and firms have a greater productive variety, competition is increased, and resources are allocated more efficiently. Gains from exchange occurs when trade enables countries to receive a higher price for its exports for greater profits, and or pays a lower price for imported goods instead of producing goods domestically at a higher cost, i.e. less efficiently. This exchange in turn leads to more efficient allocation of resources by increasing production of the export goods and reducing production of the import goods in each country. Trading partners, this efficiency allows competition of a large bundle of goods, thus increases overall welfare. The fact that trade increases overall welfare does not, of course, mean that every individual consumer and producer is better off. What it does mean is that the winners could in theory compensate the losers and still be better off. Trade also leads to greater efficiency by fostering specialization based on comparative advantage. Additional trade models such as the Ricardian model and the Hexker Olin model focus on specialization and trade according to comparative advantages rising from differences in technology and factors endowment respectively. These models will be discussed in the next section. Newer models of trade focus on gains from trade and results from economies of scale, greater product variety, and increased competition in open economy. Increased competition from foreign firms reduce the monopoly power of domestic firms and force them to become more efficient, and compared to closed economy industries that exhibit increasing returns of scale for benefits from increased market size as a country starts trading because the average cost of production declines as output increases in the industry. Monopolistically competitive markets of trade have been used to explain why there is a significant two-way trade between two countries within the same industry. Intra-industry trade occurs when a country exports and imports goods and in the same products category or classification. In a monopolistically competitive industry, there are many firms, each firm producing a unique or differentiated product. There are no exit or entry barriers, and long-run economic profit are zero. In such a model, even though countries may be similar, they gain from trade because such countries focus on production and exports of one or more variety of goods and imports other varieties of goods. For example, the European Union exports and imports different goods and different types of cars. Consumers gain from having access to greater variety of final goods. Firms benefit from greater economies of scale because both within and outside the EU are able to sell their goods in both markets. Hence, scale economies allow firms to benefit from a larger market size and experience lower average costs of production. And the result of trade research suggests that trade liberalization can lead to increasing real, that is, inflation-adjusted GDP. Although the strength of this relationship is still debated, the positive influence of trade on GDP can arise from more efficient allocations of resources, learning by doing, higher productivity, knowledge spillovers, and trade induces changes in policies and institutions that affect the incentives for innovation. In industries where there is learning by doing, such as the semiconductor industry, the cost of producing per unit declines as output increases because the expertise and experience requires in the process of production. Trade can lead to increased exchange of ideas, freer flow of technical experience, the greater awareness of changing consumer taste and preference in global markets. It can also contribute to the development of higher quality and more effective institutions and policies that encourage domestic innovation. For example, Hauptmann also shows that foreign research and development has beneficial effects on domestic productivity, and effects have been strong. And more open an economy is to foreign trade, they estimate that about a quarter of the benefits of R&D investment in G7 countries occur in the trading partners. Hill discusses the case of Logistech, a Swiss company that manufactures computer mice. Computer mice. In order to win original equipment manufacturers contracts from IBM and Apple, Logitech needed to develop innovative designs and provide high-volume production at a low cost. So in the late 1980s, they moved to Taiwan, which had a highly qualified labor force, competent parts suppliers, and rapidly expanding local computer industry, and offered Logitech space in Science Park at a very competitive rate. Soon, therefore, Logitech was able to secure the Apple contract. Opponents of free trade point the potential for greater income inequality and the loss of jobs in developed countries as a result of import competition. As the country moves towards freer trade, there will be adjustments in domestic industries that are exporters, as well as those that face import competition. Resource investments may need to be reallocated into or out of the industry depending on whether the industry is expanding or contracting. As a result of adjustment process, less efficient firms may be forced to exit the industry, which may in turn lead to higher unemployment and lead to displacement workers to be retaining for jobs in expanding industries. The counter argument is that although these may be short-term, even in the medium-term cost, these resources are likely to be more effective reemployed into other industries in the long run. Nevertheless, the adjustment process is virtually contains to impose costs on some groups of stakeholders. For example, U.S. textile industry has undergone significant changes in the past 30 years as a result of competition for lower price imports produced in developing countries, including increased outsourcing of U.S. production firms. Production by U.S. firms. Example 1 discusses recent development and projections for future employment of the industry. So the U.S. textile industry. Comparative advantage and gains from trade. At this point, we have not been precise about what it means that a country has a comparative advantage in the production of specific goods and services. In the section, we define comparative advantage, distinguish between the notion of absolute advantage and domestic, and demonstrate the gains from trade in accordance with comparative advantage. We then explain the two traditional models of trade, the Ricardian and the Hexker-Aldlin models, and the source of competitive advantage in each model. The gains in trade, absolute and comparative advantage. A country has an absolute advantage in production of goods and services if it is able to produce the goods at a lower cost or use fewer resources in its production and its trading partners. For example, suppose a worker in Brazil can produce 20 pens or 40 pens in a day. A worker in China could produce 60 pens or 10 pens or 60 pens a day. A Chinese worker produces 60 pens a day, while a Brazilian worker produces only 40 pens a day. Hence, Chinese produces pencils at a lower cost than Brazil, and has an absolute advantage in the production of pencils. Similarly, Brazil produces pen at a lower cost than China, and hence has an absolute advantage in the production of pens. A country has a comparative advantage in the production of a good if the opportunity cost for producing the good is less than its trading partner. In our example, the opportunity cost for producing an extra pen in China is 6 pens. It is the opportunity cost foregone, namely, the number of pencils China would have to give up to produce an extra pen. If Brazil does not trade and has to produce both pens and pencils, it will have to give up 2 pencils in order to gain a pen. Similarly, each pen will cost 6 pencils. Hence, the opportunity cost of pen in Brazil is 2 pencils, whereas it is 6 pencils in China. Brazil has a lower opportunity cost and thus a comparative advantage in the production of pens. China has a lower opportunity cost than Brazil in the production of pencils, and thus has a comparative advantage in the production of pencils. Example 3 further illustrates this concept. It is important to note that even if a country does not have an absolute advantage in the production of any good, it can still gain the trade by exporting a good in which it has a comparative advantage. Example 3, if India can produce only 6 yards of cloth per day instead of 16 yards of cloth, the United Kingdom will have the absolute advantage in both machine and cloth. However, India will still have a comparative advantage in the production of cloth because the opportunity cost in a yard of cloth in India is 1/3 of the machine in this case, will still be less than the opportunity cost of the yard of the cloth in UK. Let us illustrate the gain from the trading according to a comparative advantage. In example 3, if the United Kingdom can sell a machine for more than 2 yards of cloth, and if India can produce a machine that is less than 8 yards of cloth, both countries will gain from trade. Although it is not possible to determine the exact world price without additional detail regarding demand and supply conditions, both countries will gain from trade as long as the world price of machinery in terms of cloth is between the autarkic price of the trading partners. If in our example, this price corresponds to a price of between 2 and 8 yards of cloth for a machine, the further away the world price of goods and services in firms of autarkic price is given in a given country, the more that country gains from trade. For example, the UK was able to sell the machines to India for 7 yards of cloth, i.e., closer to India's autarkic price. If it gained 5 yards of cloth per machine sold in India compared with its own autarkic price with no trade of one machine of 2 yards of cloth. However, so this is literally just comparative and absolute advantage. Okay, shouldn't be that hard to understand. And what is this part about? Okay. A discussion of absolute and comparative advantage and gains and specialization would be incomplete without a discussion of two important theories of trade: the Ricardian model and the Huxner-Olin model. The model has been based on cross-country differences in technology and in factors endowment, respectively. These theoretical models are based on several assumptions, some of which may not be fully satisfied in the real world. Nonetheless, they provide an extremely useful insight in the determinants of patterns of trade. Adam Smith argued that a country can gain from trade if it had an absolute advantage in the production of goods. David Ricardo extends Smith's idea to gain from trade's ideas by arguing that even if a country didn't have an absolute advantage in the production of any good, it could still gain from trade if it has a comparative advantage in the production of a good. In a Ricardian model, labor is the only variable factor of production. Differences in labor productivity reflect the underlying differences in technology and the source of comparative advantage, and hence the key driver of trade in this model. A country with a lower opportunity cost in the production of a good has a comparative advantage in the goods and will specialize in its production. In our two-country model, if countries vary in size, the smaller country may specialize completely, but may not be able to meet the total demand for their products. Hence, the larger country may be incompletely specialized, producing and exporting the good in which they have a comparative advantage in, but still producing and consuming some of the goods in which which is comparative disadvantage. And it is important to recognize that although differences in technology may be a major source of comparative advantage at a given point in time, other countries can choose to close technology gaps or even gain a technological advantage. The shifts in information technology services from developed countries to India is an example of comparative advantage shifting over time. This shift was facilitated by India's growing pool of highly skilled and relatively low-wage labor, the development of growth of this telecommunication infrastructure, and government policies that liberalized trade in the 1990s. The Huxner-Olin model, also known as the factor proportion theory, both capital and labor are are labor factors of production. That is, each good can be produced with varying combinations of labor and capital. According to this model, differences in the relative endowment of these factors are the source of the country's comparative advantage. This model assumes that technology in each industry is the same among countries, but it varies between industries. Okay. Relative factors. Changes in factors of endowment can cause changes in the pattern of trade and can create profitable investment opportunities. For example, in 1967, Japan has a comparative advantage in unskilled labor intensive goods such as textiles, apparel, and leather. Notes by the 1980s, Japan has greatly increased its skilled labor and consequently has a comparative advantage in skilled intensive products, especially non-electrical machinery. It is important to note that technological differences, as emphasized in the Ricardian trade model, and differences in factors distributions are emphasized in the Huxner-Olin model, and both important drivers of trade. They are complementary, not mutually exclusive. Tastes and preferences can vary among countries and can change over time, leading to changes in trade patterns and trade flows. Yeah, so that's reading 19, the first part. I'm going to continue just reading by going over trade and capital flows, restrictions, and agreements in our next reading. So I hope to see you guys there, and goodbye. Continue reading of the CFA Level 1 program curriculum. Part 3, Trade and Capital Flows, Restrictions and Agreements. Trade restrictions or trade protections are government policies that limit the ability for domestic households and firms to trade freely and with other countries. Examples of trade restrictions include tariffs, import quotas, voluntary export restraints, subsidies, embargoes, and domestic current content requirements. Tariffs are taxes that a government levies on imported goods. Quotas restrict the quantity of goods that can be imported into a country, generally for a specified period of time. A voluntary export restraint is similar to a quota, but is imposed on the exporting country. An export subsidy is paid by the government to firms when it exports a unit of good and is being subsidized. The goal here is to promote exports, but it reduces welfare for encouraging production of trade, and that is inconsistent with the comparative advantage. Domestic content provision stipulates that some percentage of the value added or component used in the production should be domestic of origin. Trade restrictions are imposed by countries of several reasons, including production established domestic industries from foreign competition, protecting new industries from foreign competition until they mature, infant industry arguments, protecting the increasing domestic employment, protecting strategic industries for national security reasons, generating revenues from tariffs, especially for developing countries, and retaliating against trade restrictions imposed by other countries. Capital restrictions are defined as control placed by foreigners on the ability to own domestic assets and others' domestic residents' ability to own foreign assets. Thus, in contrast with trade restrictions, which limits the openness of the goods market, capital restrictions limit the openness of the financial market. Section 3.1 through 3.4 discusses trade restrictions. Section 3.5 briefly addresses capital restrictions. Tariffs are taxes and government levies on imported goods. The primary objective of tariff is to protect domestic industries and produce the same or similar goods. They may also aim to reduce a trade deficit. Tariff reduce the demand for imported goods by increasing their price above the free trade price. The economic impact of a tariff on imports in a small country is illustrated in Exhibit 12. In the context, a small country is not necessarily the small in size, population, or GDP. Instead, a small country is one that is a price taker in the world market for a product and cannot influence the world market price. For example, by many measures, Brazil is a large country, but if it's a price taker on the world market for cars. A large country, however, is a large importer of the product and can exercise some influence on price on the world market. When a large country imposes a tariff, the exporter reduces the price of the good to retain some of the market share. It could lose if it did not lower its price. This reduction in price alters the terms of trade and represents the redistribution of income from the exporting country to importing countries. So in theory, it is possible for a large country to increase its welfare by imposing a tariff if the trade partners does not retaliate, and two, if that weight loss as a result of the tariff see below is smaller than the benefit of improving its terms of trade. However, there would still be net reduction in global benefit or global welfare. The large country cannot gain by imposing a tariff unless it imposes an even larger loss on its trading partner. Exhibit 12, in the world price or the free trade price in P star under free trade, domestic supply of Q1 is domestic consumption of Q4 and imports of Q1, Q4. After the implementation of the per unit tariff of T, the domestic price increases to PT, which is the sum of the world price and the per unit tariff. At the new domestic price, domestic production increases to Q2 and the domestic consumption declines to Q3, resulting in the reduction of the imports of Q2, Q3. The welfare effect is summarized as follows. The consumers suffer as a loss of consumer surplus because of the increase in prices. The effects represented as such. Local producers gain producer surplus for a higher price for the outputs. This is reflected as area of 4. The government gains tariff revenue and imports of Q2, Q3. This effect is represented by area C. The net welfare effect is the sum of these three effects. The loss of the consumer surplus is greater than the sum of the gain of the producer surplus and government revenue and results of the debt loss of the country's welfare. Countries create that weight loss because they give rise to inefficiencies on both the consumption and production side. B represents the inefficiencies in production instead of being able to import goods at the world price, or P star. Tariffs encourage inefficiencies in producers where cost and production is greater than P star to enter or remains in the market, leading to and inefficient allocation of resources on the consumption side. Tariffs prevent mutually beneficial exchanges from occurring because consumers will be willing to pay more than P star and less than willing to pay P2, PT are now unavailable to consume the good. So here's the trade diagram illustrating the welfare effects and the stakeholders of the tariff on an import price quantity exchange diagram. A quota restricts the quantity of a good that can be imported into a country, generally in the form of a period of time. An import license specifies the quantity that can be imported. For example, the European Union operates a system of annual import quotas for steel producers who are not members of the World Trade Organization. In 2010, the quota was 0.2 million tons a year for Kazakhstan. In the case of Russia, the quota was 3.2 million tons per year with the part of EU-Russia agreement. A key difference between tariff and quota is that the government is able to collect the revenue generated from a tariff. This effect is uncertain under a quota. With quotas, foreign producers can often raise the price of the goods and earn greater profits than what they would do without a quota. These profits are called quota rents. In Exhibit 12, if the quota is Q star, a Q2, 3, a Q2, 3, Q2, Q3, the equivalent tariff will restrict imports from Q2 to Q3, and T and the domestic producers after the quota of P2 thus is the same as the domestic price after the tariff T was imposed. Area C, however, is now the quota rent or profit that are likely to be captured by the foreign producers rather than a tariff revenue that is captured by the domestic government. If the foreign producers or foreign government captures the quota rent C, then the welfare loss to the importing country represented by area in Exhibit 12 under a quota is greater than under the equivalent tariff. If the government of a country that imposes the quota can capture the quota rents by auctioning the import license for a fee, there would be welfare loss. Under the quota is similar to that of a tariff represented by areas of B to D. A voluntary export restraint or VER is a trade barrier under which the exporting country agrees to limit the exports of goods it is trading to its trading partner to a specified number of units. The main difference between an import quota and a VER is the former is imposed by the importer, while the latter is imposed by the exporter. The VER or the voluntary export restraint allows the quota rent resulting from a decrease in trade to be captured by the exporter or the exporting country, whereas in the case of the import quota, there's ambiguity regarding who captures the quota rents. Hence, the VER results in welfare loss in the importing country. For example, in 1981, the Japanese government imposed the VER on automobile exports to the United States. Export subsidies an export subsidy is a payment by the government to a firm for either a unit of goods that is being imported. The goal is to stimulate exports, but it interferes with the functioning of the free market and to distort free trade away from the comparative advantage. Hence, it reduces welfare. Countervailing duties and duties that are levied by importing countries against subsidized exports entering the country. As an example, agricultural subsidies in developing countries or developed countries, notably the EU, have been have been a continuous issue in trade negotiation with less developed countries and developed countries that are agricultural exporters, such as New Zealand and Australia. In the case of an export subsidy, the exporter has an incentive to shift sales from the domestic to the export market because it receives international price plus per unit subsidy for each unit of good exported. This scenario raises the price in the domestic market by the amount of the subsidy in the smaller country's case. Price before subsidy plus a subsidy in the large country's case. The world price declines as the large country increases exports. The net welfare effect is negative in both the large and small country's case. With a larger decline in a large country's case, this results is both because of the largest country's case. The declining in the world price implies that a part of the subsidy is transferred to a foreign country, unlike in the smaller country's case. Exhibit 13 summarizes some of these effects. It is important to understand existing trade policies and the potential for policy changes that may impact returns on investment. Changes in government trade policies can affect the pattern to value of trade and may result in changes in industry structure. These changes may have important implications for firm profitability and growth because they can affect the goods a firm can import/export, change the demand for its products, impact its pricing policies, and create delays through increased paperwork. Procurement of license approvals and so on. For example, changes in import policies and affects the ability for a firm to import vital imports, and production may increase the cost of production and reduce the profitability. Trading blocks, common markets, and economic unions. There have been a proliferation of trading blocks and regional trading agreements in recent years. Important examples: regional integration of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the European Union. A regional trade bloc is a group of countries that have signed an agreement to reduce to progressively eliminate barriers to trade and movement of factors of production among the members of the bloc. It may or may not have common trade barriers against countries that are not members of the bloc. There are many different types of regional trade blocs. Depending on the level of integration that takes place, free trade areas are one of the most prevalent forms of regional integration, in which all barriers of flows of goods and services among members have been eliminated. However, each country maintains its own policies against non-members. The North American Free Trade Agreement and among the United States, Canada, and Mexico are an example of the free trade agreement. Customs Union extends the free trade agreement, but not only allowing free movement of goods and services among members, but it also creates a common trade policy against non-members. In 1947, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg formed the Customs Union that has become part of the European Community in 1958. A common market is the next level of economic integration that incorporates all aspects of a customs union and extends it by allowing the movement of factors of production among members. The Southern Cone Common Market of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay are examples of a common market. The economic union requires an even greater degree of incorporations and incorporates all aspects of the common market, in addition to requires common economic institutions and coordinations of economic policies among members. The European Common Market, the European Community became the European Union in 1993. If the members of the economic union decide to adopt a common currency, it becomes a monetary union. For example, with the adoption of the euro, 19 EU members countries formerly known as the monetary union. Regional integration is popular because eliminating trade and investment barriers among a small group of countries is easier, politically less containous, and quicker to the multinational trade negotiations under the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is the negotiating forum that deals with the rules of global trade between nations and where member countries can go to sort out trade disputes. The latest round of trade negotiations was launched by the World Organization in 2001 at Doha, Qatar, includes several continuous issues of specific concerns in developing countries, such as the cost of importing and implementing trade policy reforms in developing countries, market access in developing countries, agricultural products, and access to affordable pharmaceuticals in developing countries. After nearly a decade of negotiations, a very limited progress has been made on the major issues. Hence, it is not surprising to see a non-renewed interest in bilateral and multilateral trade liberalization on a smaller scale. Policy coordinations and harmonizations are also easier among a smaller group. Regional integration results in preferential trade treatment for members corresponding with non-members and lead to changes in the patterns of trade. Member countries move toward freer trade. Member countries move to fair trade by eliminating or reducing trade barriers against each other, leading to a more efficient allocation of resource. But regional integration may also result in trade and production being shifted from a lower cost non-member who still faces trade barriers to a higher cost member who faces no trade barriers. The shift leads to a less efficient allocation of resources and can reduce welfare. Hence, there are two static effects that are direct results of the formation of a custom union: trade creation and trade diversion. The trade creation occurs when regional integration results in the replacement of higher cost domestic producers by lowering cost imports from the other members. For example, consider two hypothetical countries. Trade diversion occurs when lower cost imports from non-member countries are replaced with higher cost imports from members. In examples of the preceding paragraph. So here's the benefit of free trade: greater specialization according to comparative advantage, reduction of monopoly power because of foreign competition, economies of scale from larger market size, learning by doing, technology transfer, knowledge spillovers, greater foreign investment, and better quality of intermediate inputs, world price. The 2009 World Development Report points to spillover of growth across borders as one of the main benefits of regional integration. There's evidence in the corresponding spillover among OECD countries, which are highly integrated both as a group and within their own geographic regions. The long-run growth of integrated countries is interconnected because members have greater access to each own's markets. Strong growth in any RTA country can have a positive impact on the growth of other RTA members countries. RTA can enhance the benefit of good policies and lead to convergence of living standards. For example, growth spillovers are likely to be much smaller among sub-Saharan Africa countries because of the lack of integration arising from deficiencies of the RTAs and inadequate levels of transportation and telecommunication infrastructure. Although regional integration has many advantages, it may impose costs on some groups. For example, there was significant concern that the United States, that the NAFTA and especially low-skilled labor-intense imports from Mexico will hurt low-skilled workers. Adjustment costs arose as import competition caused inefficient firms to exit the market, and the workers in the firms were at least temporarily unemployed as they sought new jobs. However, the surviving firms experienced an increase in productivity. The U.S. consumer benefited from the increase in product varieties imported from Mexico. It is important to recognize, however, that workers displaced by regional integration may have to bear long-term losses if they are unable to find jobs and wages comparable with the jobs they lost, or they remain unemployed for long periods of time. For example, although import competition was certainly not one factor that led to a dramatic contraction in U.S. automobile industry, the impact of employment in the industry was likely a permanent, and many former auto workers, especially older workers, could never find a comparable job. Concerns regarding national sovereignty, especially where big and small nations may be part of a same bloc, having also been implemented by the former FTAs and proposals by South Asian regional bloc, and face challenges regarding India's role because it is one of the biggest economies in the region. Regional integration is important because from an investment perspective, because it offers new opportunities for trade and investment. The cost of doing business in a large single regional market is lower, and firms have benefits from economies of scale. However, it is important to note that difference in taste, cultural, and competitive conditions still exist among members and trading blocs. These differences may limit the potential benefit from investment within a bloc, and in addition, developing on the level of integration and safeguard and public problems faced by individual member countries and the RTA may quickly spread to other countries in the bloc. There are at least two challenges in the formation of RTA and in its potential progression from a free trade area to a deeper integration in the form of customs unions, common markets, and economic unions. First, cultural differences and historical considerations, for example, wars and conflicts, may complicate the social/political process of integration. Second, maintains of high degrees of economic integrations. Limit the extent to which member countries can pursue independent economic and social policies. Free trade and mobility of labor and capital tends to thwart policies aimed at controlling relative price and or quantities within a country. While balancing economic policies, this situation is especially true in the case of monetary unions, because monetary policy is not only the control of individual countries and currency. Devaluation/revaluation is not available as a tool to correct persistent imbalances. When persistent imbalances do arise, they might lead to crises that spill over to other countries, forcing similar problems. A recent example is the fear of contagion cause of the Greek financial crisis in 2010. In May 2010, Standard & Poor reduced the credit rating of Greece governments from investment grade to junk status. It also downgraded the government's debt from Spain and Portugal. These countries were suffering from a combination of high government deficits and slow GDP growth. The credit downgrade increases fears that Greece in particular would default on its debt and cause economic turmoil, not only among the healthier countries of the EU, but also in the United States and Asia. The EU and International Monetary Fund (IMF) agreed to a $145 billion US dollars bailout for Greece in May 2010 and provided Ireland with a financing package around $113 billion in November 2010. As late 2010, there were continuing concerns about the financial health of Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. The EU, which created the European Financial Stability Facility in 2010 to help EU countries in need, has been debating the need for an expansion in the scope of financing capacity for the EFSFs. Capital restrictions. There are many reasons for governments to restrict inwards and outwards flow of capital. For example, the government may want to meet some objectives regarding employment or regional development, or may have a strategic or defense-related objective. Many countries require approval for foreigners to invest in the country, and for citizens to invest abroad. Control over inward investment by foreigners result in restrictions on how much can be invested and on the type of industries in which the capital can be invested. For example, such strategic industries as defense and telecommunication are often subject to ownership restrictions. Overflow restrictions can include restrictions on repatriations of capital, interest, profits, royalty payments, and licensing fees. Citizens are often limited in their ability to invest abroad, especially in foreign exchanges, scarce economies, and there can be deadlines for repatriations of income earned from the investments abroad. Economists consider free movement of financial capital to be beneficial because it allows capital to be invested where it will earn the highest return. Inflows of capital also allows countries to invest in productive capacity at a rate that is higher than can be achieved with domestic savings alone. It can enable countries to achieve a higher rate of growth. Larger term investment by foreign firms can establish a presence in the local economy, can bring not only much needed capital, but also new technology skills and advanced production and management practices, as well as creative spillover benefits for local firms. Investment by foreign firms can also create a network of local suppliers if they source some of their components locally, such as suppliers may receive advanced training and spillover benefits from a close worker relationship from the foreign firm. On the other hand, increased competition from foreign firms in the market may force domestic firms to become more efficient. Foreign firms on the market may force domestic firms to be more efficient. On the other hand, it is possible that domestic industry may be hurt because domestic firms are unable to compete with the foreign firms and therefore exit the market. In times of macroeconomic crisis, capital mobility can result in capital flight of countries, especially in most of the inflows reflect short-term portfolio flows into stocks, bonds, and other liquid assets rather than flows directly into investments in productive assets. In such circumstances, capital restrictions are often used in conjunction with other policy instruments such as fixed exchange rate targets. Capital restrictions and fixed exchange rate targets are complementary instruments because in a regime of perfect capital mobility, governments cannot achieve domestic and external policy objectives simultaneously. Using only standard monetary and fiscal policy tools By limiting the free flow of capital, capital control provides a way to exercise control over a country's external balances, whereas more traditional macroeconomic tools are used to address other objectives. Modern capital controls were developed in diligence with in the remnants of World War I as a method to finance the world effort. At the start of the war, all major powers restricted capital outflows, i.e. the purchase of foreign assets and loans abroad. The restrictions raised revenues, but keeping capital in domestic economy facilitates the taxation of wealth and producing interest economies. Moreover, capital control helps to maintain a low level of interest rates, reducing government's borrowing costs on its liabilities. Since World War I, controls on capital inflows has been used similarly in other countries, mostly developing countries, to generate revenue from governments or to permit them for allocating credit in the domestic economy, whereas risking capital flight. In broad terms, a capital restriction is any policy designed to limit or redirect capital flows. Such restrictions may take the form of taxes, price or quantity controls, or outright prohibitions of international trade and assets. Price control may take the form of special taxes on return to international investment, taxes on certain types of transactions, or monetary reserve requirements, that is, a requirement forcing foreign partners or parties wishing to deposit money in domestic banks to account for deposit. Some of the quantity restrictions on capital flow may include rules imposing ceilings and requirements, specializing authorities for new or existing borrowers, foreign creditors, or they may be administrative controls on cross-border capital movement, in which a government agency may approve transactions for a certain type of asset. Effective implementation of capital restrictions may entail non-trivial administration costs, particularly if the measure has been broadened to close potential loopholes. There is always a risk of protecting the domestic financial market by capital restrictions might postpone necessary policy adjustments to impede a private sector adaptations of changing international circumstances. More importantly, controls may give rise to negative market perception, which may in turn make it more costly and difficult for a country to access foreign funds. In a study on the effectiveness of capital controls, the International Monetary Fund consider restrictions on capital inflows and inflows separately. The authority concluded that for restrictions on capital inflows to be effective, i.e. not cumulative, the coverage needs to be comprehensive and controls need to be implemented forcefully. Considerably administrative costs are incurred to continuously amending and monitoring compliance with the regulations. Although controls on inflows appeared to be ineffective in some countries, it was difficult to distinguish the impact of controls from the impact of other policies, such as strengthening or prudent regulations, increased exchange rate flexibilities, and adjustments in monetary policy. In the case of capital outflows, the imposition of controls during episodes of financial crisis seems to have produced mixed results, providing only temporary relief of varying durations of some countries for successfully shielding others, e.g. Malaysia, the providing with insufficient and restructure of their economies. Okay. The balance of payments. The balance of payments is a double-entry bookkeeping system that summarizes a country's economic transactions with the rest of the world for a particular period of time, typically a calendar quarter or year. In this context, a transaction is defined as an economic flow that reflects the creation, transformation, and exchange of extinction of economic values and exchange and involves exchanges of ownership of goods and or financial assets, the provision of services, and provision of labor and capital. In other words, the balance of payments reflects payments for exports and imports, as well as financial transactions and financial transfers. Analyzing the balance of payments is an important element in assessing a country's macroeconomic environment, its monetary and fiscal policy, and its long-term growth potential. Investors use data to trade the capital flows to evaluate a country's overall level of capital investment, profitability, and risk. The following section describes the balance of payments, the factors that influences it, and the impacts on exchange rates, interest rates, and capital market transactions. Balance of payments, the BOP, is a double-entry system in which every transaction involves both a direct credit and both a debit and a credit. In principle, the sum of all debt entries should equal the sum of all credit entries, and the net balance of all entries of the BOP statement should equal 0. In practice, however, this is rarely the case because the data used to record the balance of payments transactions is often derived from different sources. Debt entries reflect purchase of import goods and services, purchases of foreign financial assets, payment received from exports, and payments received from other debtors. Credit entries reflect payments of imported goods and services, payments for purchase foreign financial assets, the payment of creditors. To put differently, a debt represents the increasing of a country's assets or decreasing in its liabilities. A credit represents the decrease in assets or increase in liabilities. For example, as shown in panel B of Exhibit 14 on September 1st, a country A production. So here's just an example. Okay, balance of payment components. BOP is comprised by a current account that measures the flow of goods and services, the capital account that measures the transfer of payments, the financial account that records the investment flows. These accounts are further degraded into subcategories. Current account. The current account can be decomposed of four sub-accounts: the merchandise trade, the services, the income receipts, and the unliterated transfers. The capital account consists of two sectors: the capital transfer and the sales and purchase of non-produced goods and financial assets. The financial account refers to the capital. Financial account can be broken down into two subsections: the financial assets abroad and the financial assets owned within the domestic country. A country's assets abroad are further divided into financial reserves, assets, government assets, and private assets. The assets include gold, foreign currency reserves, foreign securities, foreign reserves of positions of international monetary funds, direct foreign investment, and claims reported by foreign banks. Foreign earned assets is the reporting country are further divided into official assets and other foreign assets. These assets include securities issued by the reporting country's government and provide sectors, e.g. bonds, equities, mortgage-backed securities, direct investment, and foreign liabilities reported by country's banking sector. Paired transactions in the BOP bookkeeping system. The following example illustrates how typical cross-border transactions are recorded in the BOP framework outlined previously. This includes commercial exports and imports, the receipt of income from foreign investment, loans made by borrowers abroad, and purchase of home country currency by foreign central banks. Exhibit 16 illustrates the various individual bookkeeping entries and perspectives of an individual country as seen through Germany. National economic activity and the balance of payments in a closed economy. All output Y is consumed or invested by the private sector, domestic households, and businesses, or purchased by the governments, letting Y denote GDP. C, private consumption. I, investment. And G, government purchase of goods and services, and the national income identified for a closed economy is given by such. When foreign trade is illustrated, however, some output is purchased by foreigners, exports, whereas some domestic spending is used for purchase of foreign goods and services or imports. National income identified for open economy is thus, where X denotes the exports and N denotes the imports. For most countries, exports rarely equal imports. The exports or difference between the exports and imports is the equivalent of the current account balance, the BOP, from the BOP perspective. When a country imports exceeds an export, the currency account is in a deficit. When a currency exports exceeds its imports, the currency account is in a surplus. At the right-hand side, equation 2 shows a currency account surplus or deficit can affect GDP. The balance of the current account is also important because it measures the size and directions of international borrowing. In order for the balance of payments to balance, a deficit or surplus in the current account must be offset by opposite balances in the sum of the capital and financial accounts. This requirement means that a country with a current account deficit has to increase its net foreign debt by the amount of the current account deficit. For example, the United States has run current account deficits for many years while accumulating net foreign liabilities. The current account deficit was financed by net capital imports, i.e. direct investment by foreigners. So that's just the equation. Here's some more equations. Okay. Trade organization. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, countries attempt to support their failing economies by sharply raising barriers to foreign trade, devaluing their currencies to compete against each other for export markets, and restricting their citizens' freedom to hold foreign exchanges. These attempts to provide are to be self-defeating. World trade declined drastically, and employment and living standards fell sharply in most countries. By the 1940s, it has become widely spread conviction that the world economy was in need of an organization that can help promote international economic cooperation. In 1944, during the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives of 45 governments agrees to a framework of international economic corporations. Two crucial multinational organizations emanated from this conference: the World Bank, which was founded during the conference, and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, which came into formal existence in December 1945. Although the International Monetary Fund was founded on the goal of stabilizing the exchange rate and assets and the reconstruction of the world's international payment system, the World Bank was created to facilitate post-war reconstruction and development. Their institution, the International Trade Organization, was to be created and handled on the trade side of the economic international corporations. Joining the two, the Bretton Woods institution drafted the ITO Charter with ambitions extending beyond the World Trade Regulations and include rules and employment, commodity agreements, restrictive business practices, international investments and services. Objective was to create the International Trade Organization and the United Nations Conference on Employment of Havens, Havana, Cuba in 1947. Meanwhile, 15 countries have begun negotiations in December 45 to reduce the regulate custom tariffs. With World War II only barely ended, they wanted to give an early boost to trade liberalization and begin to correct the legacy of the protectionism measures that has renamed the past since the 1930s. The group has expanded to 23 nations at the time of the deal of 1947, and the General Assembly of Tariffs and Trade was born. The Havana Conference began in November 1947. Less than a month after the GATT was signed, this ITO Charter was formally approved in Havana in March 1948. There are ratifications in some national legislature provide impossible. The most serious opposition was the U.S. Congress, even though U.S. government have been one of the driving forces. In 1950, the United States government announced that it would not seek congressional ratification of the Havana Charter. Drink water to them. That's it. Cold water. Iced water. As we saw earlier, current account deficits reflect a shortage of net savings in an economy and can be addressed by policies designed to rein in domestic demand. This approach could, however, have adverse consequences for domestic employment. The IMF stands ready to lend foreign currencies to member countries to assist them during periods of significant external deficits. A pool of gold and currency distributed by members provides the IMF with a resource required to lead operations. The fund are only lent under strict conditions, and borrowing countries' macroeconomic policies and continually monitored. The IMF's main mandate is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, the system of exchange rates and international payment that enables countries to buy goods and services from each other. More specifically, the IMF provides a form of cooperation on international monetary problems, facilitates growth of international trade and promotes employment, economic growth and poverty reduction, supports exchange rate stability and an open system of international payments, and lends foreign exchange to members who need it on a temporary basis under adequate safeguards, and help them address balance of payment problems. The global financial crisis of 2007-2009 demonstrates that domestic international financial stability cannot be taken for granted, even the world's most developed countries. In the light of the event, the IMF has redefined the deepened operations by such: enhancing its lending facilities, improving the monitoring of global, regional, and country economies, helping resolve global economic imbalances, analyzing capital markets and development, and assessing financial sector vulnerabilities. Okay. World Bank Group and World Trade Organization. Okay, that's pretty much it. Okay, summary. The reading provides a framework of analyzing a country's trade and capital flows and their economic implications. It examines basic models and that explains trade based on comparative advantage and provides a basis for understanding how international trade can affect the rates of composition of economic growth as well as the attractiveness of investment in various sections. The benefit of trade include gains from exchange and specialization, gains from economic skills, and companies add new markets for their products, a greater variety of products available to households and firms, and increased competition and more efficient allocation of resources. A country has an absolute advantage in producing a good or service if it is able to produce the good at a lower absolute cost or use fewer resources in the production than its trading partner. A country has a comparative advantage in the production of good if its opportunity cost of production is good. That good is less than that of its trading partner. Even if a country does not have an absolute advantage in the production of any good, it can gain from trade producing and exporting of the good, in which it has a comparative advantage, and importing goods, in which it has a comparative disadvantage. In the Ricardian model of trade, comparative advantage and the pattern of trade are determined by differences in technology between countries. And the Hexner-Odlin model of trade, comparative advantage and the pattern of trade are determined by differences by factors of endowment between countries. In reality, technology factors in the technology and factor endowment are complementary, not mutually exclusive determinants of trade patterns. Trade barriers prevent free flow of goods and services among countries. Government imposes trade barriers and various reasons, including to promote specific development objectives, to counteract certain imperfections in the function of markets, or to respond to problems facing their economies. For purposes of international trade policies and analyzing a small country is defined as one that cannot affect the world price of traded goods. The large country's production and or consumption decisions do alter the relative prices of traded goods. In a small country, trade barriers generate a net welfare loss arising from deterioration of production and consumption decisions and association and efficiency allocations of resources. Trade barriers can generate a net welfare gain in a large country if the gains from improving the terms of trade, higher export prices and lower import prices, moves then offers or offsets the loss from the distortion of resource allocations. However, the larger country can only gain if it imposes an even larger welfare loss than its trading partner. An import tariff can only import quotas have the specific effects on price, production, and trade. With a quota, however, some or all of the revenue that will be raised by equivalent tariff is instead captured by foreign producers or the foreign government as quota rents. Thus, the welfare loss suffered by the importing countries is generally greater with a quota. A voluntary export restraint is imposed by the exporting country. It has the same impact as an importing country as an import quota, with the from which foreigners capture all of the quota rents. An export subsidy encourages firms to export their products rather than sell it in the domestic market. The distortion of production, consumption, and trade decision generates a welfare loss. The welfare loss is greater for a large country because increased production and exports of the stabilized products reduces its global price. That is, worsens the country's terms of trade. Capital restrictions are defined as controls placed on foreigners' ability to own domestic assets and or domestic residents' ability to own foreign assets. In contrast, a trade restriction which limits the operation, the openness of goods, the good market. Capital restrictions limits the openness of the financial market. A regulation trading bloc is a group of countries who has signed an agreement to reduce the progressively eliminate barriers to trade and movement of factors of production among the members of the bloc. They may or may not have a common trade barrier against their countries. Against the bloc, a customs union extends the FTA by not only allowing free movement of goods and services among members, but also creates a common trade policy against non-members. A common market incorporates all aspects of the customs union and extends it by allowing free movement of factors of production among members, such as workers. In the European Union, if you are the citizen of countries such as Cyprus, which is part of the European Union, you get to work in Germany indefinitely, for example, or UK indefinitely. But with Brexit, that's a little bit different. An economic union incorporates all aspects of a common market and requires common economic integration and coordination of economic policies among members. Members of a monetary union adopt a common currency. Okay. From an investment perspective, it is important to understand the complex and dynamic natures of trading relationship because they can help identify potential profitable investment opportunities as well as provide some advanced warning signals regarding when a disinvestment in the market or industry. The major components of the balance of payments are the current account balance, which largely reflects the trade in goods and services, capital account balance, which mainly consists of capital transfers and net sales of non-produced, non-financed assets, and the financial account, which measures the net capital flows based on sales and purchases of domestic and foreign financial assets. Decisions by consumers, firms, and governments influences the balance of payments. Low private savings and or high investment tends to produce a current account deficit and must be financed by net capital imports. High private savings and or low investment, however, produces a current account surplus balanced by net capital export. All else the same, a government deficit produces a current account deficit, and a government surplus leads to a current account surplus. All else the same, or ceteris paribus, sustaining current account deficit contributes to a rise in risk premium for financial assets of the deficit countries. Current account surplus countries tend to enjoy lower risk premiums than current account deficit countries. Created after World War II, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO are the three major international organizations that provide necessary stabilization to international monetary systems and facilitates international trade and development. The IMF's mission is to ensure the stability of international monetary system, the system of exchange rates and international payments, and enables countries to buy goods and services from each other. The IMF helps to keep a country's